Well, welcome to the Willow Creek Association's monthly webcast. And that passage that was just highlighted there in the video from Matthew 25 is such a powerful reminder that we, the body of Christ, are indeed called to be the hands and feet of Jesus to those that are in need. And today we're going to talk about something that is a front burner to Jesus, and that's the poor. And he talked about the plight of the poor often in his ministry here on earth, and my hope is that by the end of our time together, we would all be inspired to take that next step as a leader and as a church on how we can be a part of the solution, even more so than we are right now. But before I introduce our guest and get into the conversation, a couple logistics. First of all, along the way, we're going to serve up some polls. They're on the right-hand side of your screen, so if you'll take a look at those, answer the questions, and we'll kind of, when we get those tabulated, we'll serve it back up to you because you can get a sense of where people are that are tuning in. And then also want to encourage you to engage the chat room, which is at the bottom of your screen. We have a team of people who are going to be interacting with you. And also along the way, if you have some questions that you'd like to ask our guest or myself, just put that question right there into the chat room. Again, our team members are going to pick that up, and then at the end of our time, we're going to be able to, I'll be able to serve those questions up to our guest. So now, let me introduce our guest. His name is Wes Stafford, and Wes was recently invited by Bill Hybels to speak at Willow Creek Community Church at our weekend services. And the reason for that is that we were wanting to highlight the value of children, and we couldn't think of a better person to do that than you, Wes.
And it was wonderful.
And I remember in Bill's introduction of you, he introduced you as really one of the finest leaders on the planet that he knew. I couldn't agree more. Wes is the president of Compassion International, and under Wes's leadership, Compassion has quintupled in size over the almost 2 decades. This year, he's going to be celebrating his 20th anniversary as president of Compassion. He's been there 35 years, but under his leadership, Compassion has almost quintupled, and they now serve about 1.3 million children annually. And they do this is what makes them very unique. They do this through a carefully cultivated network of 6,000 indigenous local churches. All the ministries of compassion are through the local church. It's an amazing thing. So Wes, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm privileged to call you a friend.
Yeah.
And this is just going to be a fun conversation to have today. So thanks for coming.
Well, it's good to be with you, Jimmy, and all you guys joining us. Yeah, let's have a fireside chat.
Great. Well, most of us know you as the president of Compassion, but I was amazed when I started to do a little bit of digging about your life pre-Compassion. So like you were in the Army. Tell us a little bit of some things about your life before you came to Compassion, because I think some of those things help mold you to be the person, the champion for children that you are today.
Well, it was a pretty wild and crazy path, and I remember when I was 27 years old and finally came to Compassion, the big joke in my family at gatherings was, what is God ever going to do with Wes? So, I grew up in a little village in Africa till I was 15 years old. Lived on the Navajo reservation during my high school years, ran track against Navajos and Mohicans and Apaches.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Didn't even know that, yes.
Distance runner or sprinter?
Distance.
Okay.
Distance.
Right. Well,
mile and half mile, and both in the same meet if they would split them up a little bit.
Well, we would have not competed against each other.
No.
I was on the short end of sprinting.
Yeah, because I always wanted to be like you. I went off to Moody Bible Institute. I washed windows in skyscrapers. I ran a printing press. Eventually, I became an ambulance attendant here in Chicago out of Elmhurst.
And you had to deliver a baby once, I heard.
Well, I delivered a bunch of babies. I picked up a guy one time in 5 pieces off the railroad track. We had to flip a coin to decide who's going to actually pick up what parts. Then I became a soldier. I got drafted into the Army during the Vietnam era. I was a spy for a while in part of that role. Got out and was a disc jockey out in Los Angeles. It's been a pretty wild and crazy trip.
No kidding. And how in the world, with that kind of a background, did you become such a champion for children that has defined your life?
Well, it all went back to my earliest roots. Once I was done with all of these incredible, chapters of life, deep in my heart, I remembered my village. I remembered my childhood. I think one of the reasons why I care so much about children is, I don't know, I was one.
Yeah.
I spent 18 years as one. But in my little village, I had my heart broken by poverty. By the time I was 15, half of my little buddies in that village had died of what I later learned was poverty. I was off for much of the years of my childhood to a boarding school that was highly, highly abusive. And I learned that, when children aren't considered very important, terrible things can happen. Yeah. So between poverty and abuse, and both of those, by the way, speak the same message into a heart of a child, and that is, you don't matter, nobody cares, nothing's going to change. With that heritage, and then the understanding that we are to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, I knew with my life that I was going to have to be a bridge between these two worlds. Having lived in Africa, now in America, I knew the cultures, I knew the languages. I knew that these two groups of people needed each other. Yeah. The poor need the resources and the encouragement of the wealthy, but the wealthy need so much from the poor. Right. The minute I got that in my head, I stumbled onto this little organization here in Chicago, up on Irving Park Road, called Compassion International. We were a storefront about the size of a 7-Eleven. And all they were doing was bridging these two worlds, little relationships across the worlds. Yeah. And the minute I saw that, I said, you know what, that's the calling on my life. Wow. That was 35 years ago. And that's really pretty much what I have been honed in. I am one focused dude. Yeah. I know what I was made for, and have given everything I have to my mission, to my calling. Yeah.
Well, and along the way, I think you've learned some really powerful things about what are the things that actually make the biggest difference in the life of a child. You've lived this pretty much your whole life. And you wrote a book recently called Just a Minute, and in it you talk about how everybody can actually be in the game of changing the life of a child. Why did you write the book, and what is it that the book captures?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book a while back called Too Small to Ignore. It was my sort of manifesto on why children are so important. Yeah. And in that, in just a couple of pages, I made the case that one of the reasons children are so important and why it's so important we minister to them is that the spirit of a child is like wet cement. It doesn't take much effort at all to make an impression, for good or for ill, by the way. Yeah. And if I argued, if God stands a child in front of you for even a minute, it might be a divine appointment. You might be the one to say the right thing, do the right thing, that launches that child. And with children, you never know when that minute is. You never know when you're making a lifelong memory.
I remember when you first told me about this book, I thought, that is so true. When I look back even on my own life, there was a word that was said, a comment that was made by different people, whether it was a parent, a Sunday school teacher, a coach, whatever, that made lasting and huge impressions on my life. You can't imagine how powerful even a minute could be in the life of a kid.
Most people, if they'll take the time to be still and ponder back, can spot a hero or two that they owe. As I was traveling, talking about that concept, around the world, whenever I got to that point, so who was it? Who believed in you before you believed in yourself? I could see that my audience kind of went into a different place. They had this faraway look in their eyes, tears down their face. I've had translators burst into sobs at that moment as they remember grandpa or a first grade teacher or something. And I began to say, there's something here that is in the heart of all of us. So I began to collect stories. And what I ultimately wrote is a book of 68 stories of people who can remember that moment. One of them that really prompted me to write this book, I was talking to a group of about 500 school teachers, I remember, and I paused in my talk to say, does this bring any memories to any of you? And a man stood up, he says, well, yeah, I do. I'm a first grade teacher. This is my first year of teaching. And listening to you, I think I remember the day I decided to be a teacher. And I said, well, will you tell us? And he said, well, I was in first grade. I had a terrible stutter. I felt like I was the stupidest kid in the room. I adored my teacher, but I never really made eye contact with her because I never knew the answers to anything she was asking. But he says, one day, we were all working independently at our desks, and I sensed that my teacher had walked up from behind me. I could smell the waft of her perfume. And I was like, oh no, and my heart started to pound when I saw her hand reach over my shoulder. I remember the color of her fingernails, and she put a gold star in the corner of my paper, and she leaned down and she whispered, my, but you're a smart little boy. I bet you grow up to be a great teacher.
Wow.
And he said, I knew in that moment that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted children to feel like that. Well, I interrupted him to say, did you ever tell her? And he says, well, no, until now it never occurred to me to tell her. I said, do you think she even knows? And he said, now tears were welling up in his eyes. He says, well, she does now. Well, there was a hush across the room. We were all picturing, do you get to listen from the balconies of heaven? How does this work? As we were thinking that, he said, because she's sitting right over there.
Wow.
And we all looked across the room, and here was this silver-haired little lady, dignified as could be, tears streaming down her face. They got up in a long overdue hug, and I said, I'm done. That's pretty much everything I wanted to tell you. But what I did from that moment on is collect stories. And some of them, Tony Dungy's story of why he is, so calm. You can destroy a child's life in a minute. The story of 11-year-old Hitler
yes, exactly.
is in this book.
It's powerful.
It doesn't explain what he did or forgive him, but it does make it somewhat predictable that a man would rise up from that level of hurt and abuse in a minute to say, no one will ever laugh at me again. I will always put down those who would harm me and hurt me or put me down.
Yeah.
So it was those kind of stories. But as I began to gather them, I began to realize in the context of Compassion's ministry that it isn't just children right in front of you. Sometimes it can be a child all the way across the world. And so some of those stories began to come in. And one of my favorites is Joshua Obrera. Joshua grew up in the slums of Nairobi. Beth Bell was his sponsor in the United States. He lived in the worst slum of the country, overwhelmed by all kinds of drugs and prostitution. He said, everything around me made me believe that nothing good could ever come in my life. Until when he was 8 years old, Beth writes him a letter as his sponsor and says, you know what, I'm watching you grow. I think you're very smart, and I think you can be anything you want to be. And this was a new thought in his life. So he dug into his schoolwork. He got through high school. He got through our leadership program. When he graduated from the leadership program, university, he got picked up by one of the biggest universities in Holland for a full ride scholarship to do a master's degree in molecular mechanisms of disease. Wow. And just this last month, I learned that he's moved on now. He graduated from there. He's at Texas A&M right now doing a PhD in the same field, and his passion is to come up with a vaccine against malaria because it stole so many of his little buddies in that little slum. And it all launched from one letter, and he can show you the letter. He still carries it in his hand. So a sentence or a minute can launch a life. Yeah. And what I've tried to do with this book is just get us all to, first of all, be thankful, and then commit ourselves that we're going to be among those that pass this blessing on to the very next child. Yeah. God stands in front of us, even if for just a minute.
Right. And there are about 1 million graduates now that have gone through the Compassion program that are in the world just like him.
Yes, Compassion is 60 years old, and we have, as you say, 1,300,000 in the program now. But over these 60 years, 1 million have graduated. Yeah. And they are out there. They are salt and light. They're pastors, they're nurses, they're doctors, they're teachers. Yeah, they've been helped, and they have a passion to pass it on.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, not too long ago here at Willow, we also invited another guest during that similar series. His name was Nicholas Kristof, and Nicholas, with his wife, wrote a book. His wife, Cheryl Wudon, wrote a book called Half the Sky. Yeah. And fantastic book. But in his talk, he said that if you happen to be born in this country, you've won the life lottery. Now, you've been all around the world, so many countries. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, that's a very good way to put it. And yeah, you're right. I'm back and forth between these worlds really on a monthly type basis, and so I see both ends of the spectrum. I think he was saying that if you got a pair of shoes on your feet, you are one of the wealthy in our world. If you have had safe water to drink today, you're one of the rare, lucky ones in our world. If you've eaten already, by the middle of the day, you're one. I maintain if you open your front door and what you see is the United States of America outside your door, you are one of the blessed. Now that's a blessing. It's also a bit of a challenge. To whom much is given, much is required. And so,
well, I on the other side of the coin there, I remember when my wife Leanne and I felt called to come here to serve at Willow Creek about 20 years ago, and we had multiple discussions around the fact that we were going to be raising our kids in a very different setting than I grew up in. I grew up in 7 different countries, being around poverty, being touched by the reality of that and needing to be on the solution side of that to the extent that I could and that our family could. Was very real in my life. I remember our family walking in the central plazas in multiple of the Latin American cities we were in and seeing families sleeping on the sidewalk, and my habit was to go to my dad and say, give me all the change you have in your pocket. I'd have him empty it out all the time, and I'd go and I'd give it, to the families that were there. It was a very real part of my life, and I thought, oh my, I'm going to raise my kids in a upper class, suburban, fairly wealthy environment. Again, we felt called here, but I know on the one hand, it's a benefit of being born in the United States because of so many things. But on the other hand, I worried about my kids growing up, and how do you withstand the inertia of entitlement that kids in well-resourced environments tend to get if unchecked, or a sense of being spoiled or entitlement, or a warped view of the world where they're living in this little 0.1% bubble and not understanding that there are a lot of needs around the world, and that what they're growing up in is in fact very, very different than how most of the world lives. And so, we felt like we had to provide intentional opportunities into our kids to help them to combat the entitlement, to combat a warped worldview. And so we try to send our kids to Latin America, to Africa, to all parts of the world to get them to experience different experiences.
Shape their hearts.
Yeah. And even sign notes at times that said, you understand your kid's going to be within 2 hours and any legitimate health care. Are you okay with this? And we had to sign that off. But, we wanted our kids to understand the world in a bigger way, and it seems to me, Wes, that through compassion, the power of a minute, you guys have been able to create a way to almost institutionalize the power of a minute happening over and over in the life of a kid from womb to college graduation systemically. Talk about the power of a minute between the sponsor and the child being sponsored, both sides of that equation.
It's you have to understand it's a two-way street. It's both ends of the bridge. I'm out there traveling all the time, and I see that Satan has one agenda, and that is separating people from God. He is particularly cruel to children because I think he understands the cement concept.
What's at stake?
And if you can destroy them when they're small, you don't have to worry about them the rest of the time. And I've watched he uses two powerful weapons to separate people from God. One of them is poverty. Poverty can do that. But he also, at the other end of the spectrum, will use comfort, the pursuit of comfort. Again, it's less misery perhaps, but it separates people from God. Totally. And what compassion has done, and your family's example, your heart for your kids is exactly what is going on in compassion. We have nearly 1 million sponsors. When we interview them, so why do you do this? What is it you care about? They say, we care about the little child in Ethiopia, but we're trying to disciple our own children. And we know that they don't learn that off television. They don't learn that hanging out in the malls. They don't learn that in the movies. They don't even learn that from the lectures that we give them about what kind of a family we are and what are our values. They learn that by what we do. And so having a compassion child in our home on the refrigerator, it shapes the prayers of our little children. Those letters when they come in from the sponsored children, we sit down as a family, we pray, we write. There's a little jar of coins on our kitchen nook where allowance goes in enough to come up with the money to sponsor that little child. We want our kids to know when they see the little picture of their sponsored brother or sister on the fridge that not every child in the world has a fridge or can get up and get a midnight snack. And so those of us who can, well, first of all, we got to be grateful that we're on the lottery winning side of this whole thing, but we have to do something about those who can't. And so on the sponsor family side of it, there's a great deal of moments to shape the spirit of little children. On the other end of the equation, every compassion child is being ministered to by a little local congregation, a little local body of believers. These are people from the same community. These are people worshiping in the same church. They know these kids, they know their families, they're living in houses just like them, they're getting their water from the same source. But these are people who have yielded their lives to Christ, people who have a heart of compassion to live it out. And these little ones, you know, our bottom line is child development, ultimately. Or better still, in the context of a church, child discipleship. Teaching them to observe all things I've commanded you. So these little ones are being loved on, not just by anybody, but by the local congregation from their own community. And they are having moments of being breathed into. My, but you're a smart little boy. My, but that was a very kind thing that you just did. My, but you're strong. Always use your strength for the Lord. I mean, these messages are going into these children from that local church day in and day out. They don't just come together once in a while. They're every day. They're at least 4 to 8 hours a week. These children are in the holistic program done by that little local church. And we make sure that it's 48 weeks a year. So they are known and they are loved. And ultimately, they're protected. But it's by God's people. And you know, if you ever travel to Compassion, you'll never see compassion over a sign over one of our churches. I don't let us put compassion on our vehicles. If anybody is going to get thanked by that local community, we want it to be that local pastor, that local body of believers, and we want to build the credibility and the impact of the church on their own community.
Well, years ago when we came across Compassion, we understood what they were about. My wife and I thought, wow, we'd love to be a part of this thing, and so we decided for each of our kids that we would encourage them to find another child that was named with their same name. And so our Esther is able to sponsor an Esther in Guatemala. And then our second child, Elizabeth, we kind of nicknamed her Busy, but Elizabeth found a child named Elizabeth in Guatemala. And David, our son, found a David in Guatemala. Now, what was miraculous in this whole thing is that, unbeknownst to us, it just so happened that all 3 of these kids were in fact in the same church. And so in the whole database, these 3 kids that we sponsored in the same church went to visit that church.
Wow.
And it's very moving to me to see how, you know, my David is growing up with David, and Esther with Esther, and Elizabeth with Elizabeth. Now 2 of my kids have graduated and they're earning money now. Without telling them, they've taken on the sponsorship every month.
They're doing it themselves.
And my son, it moves me to tears when that letter comes in from the Guatemala, from David, and we put that letter out there. We have never had to cajole or push our kids to write in return. And in the next day or 2, that letter from our David is back on the counter to mail back to.
Right out of his own heart.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I, you know, it's been such a powerful thing for our kids to be involved in this thing. And I'd like to show you a little video that Compassion did of one of our kids that shows you a little bit of the dynamic that's happening between my Elizabeth and an Elizabeth in Guatemala. Take a look.
Our story begins with actually my dad. He came to us 3 kids and he said, we're going to start sponsoring a child through Compassion, and I chose Elizabeth because she has the same exact name as me, and that's where our story began.
My name is Elizabeth. I am 10 years old and this is my story. I live here in Sao Paulo, Guatemala with my father and younger brother and 2 sisters. 2 years ago, my father had a bad fall while working and hurt his back very badly. He couldn't move or walk and still can hardly work to earn money for us. Just 2 months later, my mother then became really sick with a fever. The next day, my mother died. Now I have to take care of my family.
I had received a letter that the mother had died, and now Elizabeth is the caretaker of her family. I just remember feeling devastated, and I was just so grateful at that time for Compassion. You know, if Compassion wasn't there, I don't even know what would happen to her or her family. I get to take part in her life and helping her get back on her feet.
I love going to the Compassion Project at the church nearby. They help me in lots of ways. The first thing we do is we pray, and we sing, and we learn a lot about Jesus. And they help me with my school and take care of me when I am sick or injured. And they give us food, which is delicious. I get letters from my sponsor, Elizabeth, and I send her letters also. I ask her to pray for me a lot. She has helped me so much through the Compassion Project.
For Elizabeth, it's the difference between health care and no health care, or school, or tutoring, or somebody just to listen to her and know her story.
My favorite Bible verse is, "Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers live in unity." Psalm 133.
Elizabeth has changed my life forever, and I think my influence on Elizabeth has done the same for her. If you want to be that person in a child's life, sponsor a child today.
Well, it's been a pretty powerful thing for our family to be involved with that.
She's a remarkable young lady.
You know, she's right across the street from you guys, at the Air Force Academy there. And
Pole vaulter.
Yeah. And a lot of her friends, actually, it's even a testimony to them, because they've seen this video, and they'll ask her about it, and how can they get involved in it too. And we recently, as a family, decided that we wanted to do what Compassion has done in starting earlier, because the child sponsorship program starts at 4 years of age, and yet there's a kind of a program that goes from in the womb to 4 years. And so now we're a part of a child survivor program.
Oh, you're doing that good.
As a family, to see the children from the womb on up.
Those first, the pregnancy and the first couple of years are just pivotal. Sometimes the damage is permanent. So we're going right down to healthy pregnancies. Right. It's so fun when these little ones get to be 3 years old and graduate from the survival program. Right. They go cap and gown like they're graduating from Harvard or something into the regular sponsorship program. It's a fun thing to see.
How cool is that? Well, another thing that Nicholas Kristof said in his book, Half the Sky, at the end of it, was that one of the things that anybody can do to be on the solution side of keeping little girls from getting caught in the sex trafficking thing, or little boys from getting caught in boy soldiering, or little boys and girls from being in child labor that's oppressive, and robs them of their childhood. One of the things that we can do is, in fact, to sponsor a child, and they list various organizations there. And the reason why, again, they're not necessarily coming from a faith perspective. They're just saying, when a child gets sponsored, you're putting other adults around that child, and the chances of them getting plucked away into these evil scenarios goes down. But Compassion does more than just put some adults around that child. What's that next step that Compassion does for the child and their family?
Well, I think they're absolutely right about the power of a child being surrounded by caring adults. In the village I grew up in Africa, we had the saying, it takes the whole village to raise a child. So we had the concept that every grown-up is responsible for the children. But we take it, I think, a step further, and the ones that we surround that child with are, in fact, God's people, that little local congregation. The sex trade industry is a horrendous $32 billion business, if you will. 27 million slaves in the world today, the majority of them little children and young women, pulled off into the sex trafficking. That is possible when people are separated, isolated from the broader community, surrounded by people. And so one of the things we do on that horrendous evil in the world is make sure that all 1.3 million children that we're ministering to are in the context of a little local church, surrounded by God's people who know them, love them, and are committed to their protection.
Right.
And what that does is it absolutely stymies the sex traffickers who work in the shadows, work in the dark. They attack those that
are isolated.
That are isolated and therefore vulnerable. So these little children are surrounded by loving people. One of my great joys, as you can imagine, being the son of a missionary and a follower of Christ myself, is that because of the work through the church and being surrounded by people who are living out their faith, having given their lives to Christ, every day 450 of Compassion-sponsored children accept Jesus Christ as their Savior. That's every day. I mean, that was yesterday, that's tomorrow, that's every day of the year, nearly 164,000 last year. Now, the rest of our outcome, the rest of our product is the discipleship of those children by people from their own culture, their own community. What does it mean to be a Christian in our village? What does integrity look like in our
Here
village?
in the United States, Wes, you know, I've seen statistics that show that within 8 weeks of conversion, the majority of people that make professions of faith can't be found in the church where they made that profession of faith. So within 8 weeks, who knows where they are. But in this particular situation, that child makes a commitment to Christ, but there's a discipleship program, you know, multiple days a week for the most 14 years of their most at-risk developmental years of their life.
That's right. They are being now discipled.
Right.
And discipleship, you know, it's easy to think, well, that's the spiritual component. You know, when Jesus said, make disciples and teach them to observe all things I've commanded you. Well, he was talking about relating to your environment in Psalm 8. He was talking to you about relating to unjust systems, which these kids often have to live under. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. He was talking about the dignity of work, about studying to show yourself approved. He was talking about what do you eat. He was talking about hygiene, sanitation. You want to learn how to dig a latrine. The Bible in Leviticus teaches you how to dig a latrine. So all of the things that a child needs to be released from poverty and leave it behind are in fact biblically based. And so if you were to ask us, so what is your outcome? What is your product? It is a child in poverty discipled to be released from poverty in Jesus' name and live their full God-given potential. Live as salt and light in your community, therefore transforming the environment in which you live.
The other thing that I found unique is that not only through the way that you guys do the ministry through a local church does it create a relationship between a sponsor and the child, but because the children are having a common experience with other children that are being sponsored inside the local church. Talk about what happens between the children that are getting sponsored in a program over time.
Yeah, well, when you consider that they are together, you know, like 8 hours a week. It's usually after they've done schooling in the morning. This is something they come to in the afternoon. Or in some countries, it's all day Saturday because the school schedule doesn't allow that. But they become, you know, more than you would even expect in a local church. They become brothers and sisters. They are raised together. They have gone through hard times together. They have celebrated together. They've grown in their faith together. This is one of the things that I love perhaps most about Compassion is now, after 60 years, we have 1 million such graduates. And they have been released from poverty, but they don't want to be released from one another. They want to stay networked, and now they've all got cell phones, and they want to be mobilized. They say, you know, let's mobilize for evangelism. Who better than us to evangelize our own country? Let's mobilize for relief when things go wrong in our countries. Let's be a job-finding place. When any of us get entrepreneurial and businesses start, let's hire our own Compassion family. Let's mobilize our spheres of influence and get godly leaders chosen in our countries. One of the greatest needs in the developing world is, I don't know, leaders with integrity, servant-hearted leaders at the national level. That is what so often keeps the oppression in place. And so we're, you know, I remember years ago we used to say, you know, you can't change the whole world, but maybe you can change the whole world for one child. It was a good marketing, make it bite-sized so everybody has but when you do this for 60 years and you've got 1 million graduates, you know, got 50,000 in Haiti alone, well, now suddenly you do have a critical mass that can change the world. We've got, you know, we've got senators in Haiti that came out of the program. We got members of parliament in Uganda, doctors, nurses, 300 pastors in South Korea. I know one of our pastors, or one of our kids who was taken out of the doorways of Seoul, Korea, who now pastors a church of 20,000 people. Can you imagine the joy of that sponsor when they walk into heaven? And they're like, really? All of these people are here because of what did I do? Oh, I sponsored him and he became a pastor. So it's a critical mass that is poised to change communities, and they're doing that, ultimately nations, and we're believing the world. I believe out of Compassion's program in the next few years will come presidents of countries. They are well on their way.
And that, I think, Wes, is why we've had such a kindred spirit and a connection, because our ministry kind of, we say, you know, if you can change a leader, you can change a church. If you can change a church, you can change a community. And you guys do a similar math where, you know, because you've bet the farm on the church, all the kid programs are through local churches, you can't have a great kid ministry, discipleship program if you don't have a great church. Can't have a great church if you don't have great leaders, etc. So that's why we keep stumbling all over ourselves around the world, because we're missionally about helping the church be this equipping agent that is in fact raising up and sending disciples of Jesus into the world to change it. So
I'll tell you what, Jimmy, the minute we at Compassion discovered Willow Creek Association, we understood your mission to build the institutional capacity of the church, and to build godly leaders. We jumped in, we put our oar in the water, we said, you know what, there's a kindred spirit. They have the same mission, the same calling. What we've tried to do as you've expanded the summit across the world is use our staff and their influence across the church in their countries to build up these gatherings. As the church grows strong, as leaders are developed, that ultimately is the most powerful thing to change nations.
yeah. Powerful.
Yeah. So
well, let's well, absolutely. Let's turn the corner a little bit and talk about church solutions, because Compassion is this wonderful ministry around the world. Let's talk about what can a church leader do, and then what can a church do to get on the solution side of this thing?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that this generation of church leaders has a burden on their shoulders, a mandate on their shoulders that the generations before them didn't have. This is the first generation, I think, who won't be able to stand before the Lord someday, which Matthew 25 tells us very clearly we will, and say, I didn't know.
Right.
I didn't know that there were people hurting like that in the world. I didn't know that you cared so much. I didn't know that you expected this of me. And so you cannot disciple this generation's people without bringing into the equation of how do you live out your faith in a hurting world a viable, real, tangible way to reach out to the poor. You simply don't have that option, this generation. So then the question becomes, so what do you do? What does a church in Kansas, a church in Montana do when the suffering is in churches, you know, way out there? And that's one of the reasons why Compassion has tried to come along to be a servant to the church at both ends of this bridge. Certainly building the institutional capacity of that little local church that ministers to the children. You know, if I was a complete atheist, but I wanted to deliver quality help to the poor, sustainable help, I would find my way to the church. It's a viable, credible grassroots institution that was there before you arrived. It'll be there if you have to leave. In the meantime, you build their capacity to not only implement Compassion's program with them, but to do anything else that God calls them, or to partner with anyone else that God calls in. Build that capacity. It's probably the second most important product of us. But then to be a servant to the church on this side, to help pastors on the resourced church side of things, to have a tool in their hands to disciple their people. So you may not be able to go all the way across the world, although that's happening more and more, but the world can come to you, your people in your pews, as you talk about the poor, and there's 2,000 verses in there about the poor, more than about heaven and hell. About a decade ago, we discovered that 50% of Americans' congregations had never heard their pastor even speak about poverty, much less challenge them to do something about it. So we love to come alongside a church, allow the members of that church to sponsor a child, let the experience with Compassion from that child or from us as we help disciple these people into living out their faith, not just in Ethiopia, but suddenly the heart is big and you're living out the faith in your own community. You're volunteering in things. The church comes alive at both ends of it. So sponsors within the church is a powerful way to disciple people in this generation. We've done some pretty exciting things at taking little churches not little churches, but churches on the United States side of things and linking them up literally one-on-one.
Right.
In a relationship with churches overseas. Compassion can do that because, I mean, we're deep in both environments.
And that's part of what has helped in our relationship and connection is we're involved in relationship with thousands of well-resourced churches in the United States. Compassion has this carefully cultivated network of thousands of churches in the under-resourced world, and we've created a church-to-church program. We've been working it the last couple of years. We have over 70 churches now that are involved in a church-to-church kind of program. What's so cool about that is that, I've been in church my whole life. And typically the way we were involved with missions is that we would write a check, or a percentage of our offerings every year would go to a missionary program. We would fund missionaries and send people, all good stuff. But seldom were we able to travel and go to the places. Some could, maybe 2%, 5% of a church can travel to be a part of seeing on the front lines of those ministries. So it was kind of investing in the things that were happening over there. With a church-to-church program, it's different, because now a church, in addition to doing some intervention programs in a region, in a church on the other side of the world, through Compassion, the Compassion can help a church build relationship with people that are in that church, that are the beneficiaries of that clean water well, or beneficiaries of that food program, or that building program that the church funded. So now, my church can help invest in building something for a church abroad, but now my kids are in relationship, or I'm in relationship with the people that are in that church, because we're corresponding multiple times a year. And so now there's not just a intellectual connection of supporting what's going on, there's a relational heart connection with what's going on over there, because it's not, it's not some person I don't know getting the benefit of that. No, it's David, it's Esther, it's Elizabeth. We know them.
Yeah, and it turns out it's very much a two-way street. It's fun to watch those who have been out there and worshipped with their brothers and sisters in a totally different culture, totally different language. We get built up. Our faith is built up. Our understanding of what compassion, the compassion of our Lord is all about. And it turns out both the water comes up and both boats float. And we can do this now. We couldn't do this 15, 20 years ago. People can now travel. People are going to get there anyway. Well over 6,000 of Compassion sponsors, met their children last year, face to face. So we're thinking, if they're going to do it, why not maximize that experience? Why not let it be very powerful at both ends of the bridge? It's a great dynamic. I think it's frankly the next wave of missions.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, Wes, because we've had conversations about that in the past. Talk about the different waves of mission effort and where you think it's going into the future in terms of churches being involved with missions.
Yeah. Well, you go back to Adoniram Judson, and those guys would pack up their belongings in wooden boxes that they expected to be their coffins. They expected to die way over there, and many of them did, and that was an era. Along came my parents, missionaries to the Ivory Coast, West Africa. We went out for 4 years at a pop. There was no way you would ever come home during, it was like going to Mars, but you would not come home during that time. And supporting churches funded that from the United States. We've moved now into a new wave, I think, where people are not willing to just give, pray, and go away. They are not just givers. This generation, I love them for it. They are investors. They want to give, absolutely, but they want to be involved. They want to get their hands into it. They want to roll up their sleeves. They want to feel it. They want to influence the people that they can influence about it. And now, with electronic communication available, now with the ability to hop on a plane and get anywhere in the world in 24 hours, we've moved into, I think, is the kind of the third wave of missions. And that's where ordinary lay people in one country can minister to ordinary lay people in another country. Turns out they need each other and both benefit. And I really can't imagine where you go from there. I think once they have met each other, they've worshiped together, they've encouraged each other, that's probably a point of no return. I can't imagine going back to an old model of just sending, Herbert and Mildred to Addis Ababa.
Well, I know here at Willow Creek we have hundreds of church partners. 200 would represent our core churches that we're partnering with, and it's all church to church. All the ministry that happens through it is church to church. And then we have probably another 400 churches that we are also involved with as well. But the whole notion of building a long-term, holistic, healthy relationship with a church in an under-resourced area, I think that's the future. And I love the fact and really appreciate that Compassion is trying to come alongside to support that church-to-church effort with this program. So I just couldn't encourage you more. If you want to find out more about that, we have some information for you there, some links to a website that you can find out more about what it means for you to sponsor a child and maybe get your kids involved. Number two, to have your church get involved in a church-to-church program that we've been honing, and it's changing both churches in amazing, amazing ways. And then also a way to get your congregation to begin to get involved in relationship with children on the other side of the world that are in terrible situations is to sponsor Compassion Sunday. Compassion has put together a wonderful set of materials and supplements for you to be able to, at least one Sunday a year, focus your church on being involved more than just through the church's programs that you fund, but also being involved relationally. And if you connect with Compassion, they might even be able to target where your church is able to kind of hone in and target the child sponsorship. So if you're really involved in the country of Guatemala, for example, maybe you can connect with Compassion and they can focus the children that your church will sponsor in Guatemala. And the synergy of that is just awesome. So I want to encourage you to take a next step on that front.
And you know, Jim, if you go to Guatemala, our Guatemalan staff will just fall all over themselves to accommodate that kind of a vision, that kind of a visit, to make it wonderful for everybody involved. We do this a lot.
Right. Well, Wes, let's turn the corner a little bit. We've actually had some questions that have come in, so let me serve those up to you, and let's see where the conversation goes.
Way to go, guys.
I'm a pastor, and I believe in the power of child sponsorship. Many of our people sponsor, but through different organizations and different countries. It feels haphazard. Is there any way to make child sponsorship more strategic in the church body?
Yeah, well, you know, there's probably 10, maybe 12 sponsorship organizations out there, and I suppose, your people are hearing about them at concerts or in magazines and such. So in this complex marketing world, they're being touched from many other parts of their life beyond just your local church. I suppose if I was pastor, I would take a good solid look at the range of sponsorship organizations and find one that matches up to your values, your vision, what you're trying to do in the discipleship of your people, and maybe not discourage your people from sponsoring children with other organizations. I'm always delighted whenever anybody cares enough to sponsor a child anywhere through any organization, but at least maybe channel the focus of your church around one or more that you can find that matches your mission, the spirit of your place, and encourage your people and make it a like do a Compassion Sunday would be a way to, if compassion was one that you were to feel comfortable with, a way to say to your people, you know what, we're going to do something together here as a church. And I've looked into these guys, or our people have traveled and seen these guys. We're comfortable with them, so let's do things together instead of just in a fragmented way.
Yeah, and I think also I would add to that, just focus on a country too, or a few countries where there's a little more synergy than just kind of spread all around the world, and perhaps where your church is in fact active.
If your mission, or if your church is a part of a mission that has a work in Mexico or Guatemala or Kenya, cluster around that. And then, if it's with Compassion, we'd help organize trips for a bunch of your people to go meet their children face to face, come back and report and lift up and build the faith of everyone who didn't get to go on a trip like that.
Another question here. What happens to sponsored children once they graduate from the Compassion program? Do you have any stats about where they end up and how effective the program is in improving the lives of the kids involved?
Yes, we have, of course, we've been at this for 60 years, but we've actually done some empirical research with University of San Francisco. It got written up in Christianity Today just a little while ago, looking at the outcomes. You know, it's good to do good. But people are wanting to know, how do we know? What is the outcome? How do we know that you're achieving your mission, your goal? And so we've been doing some, knowing that this generation are investors, not givers. We've been doing a lot of it, and the things we've been discovering are incredibly exciting. The kids coming through the program far more likely to wind up as leaders within their community, far more likely to actually get white-collar work instead of just the peasant or fishing work of their parents. The socioeconomic strata of the family have gone up, far more likely to have a cell phone, our research tells us. We're thinking, well, that's kind of a materialistic thing perhaps, but it actually is, no, they are connected to their world and they understand that they are in a place to influence how other people think. Far more likely to finish high school, far more likely to get into college. I mean, we've been studying this research to know that these are the outcomes of our particular product. And then to watch the socioeconomic strata of the communities around where this little church is located, blessing the entire people of the community, is something that we're documenting and are very excited about.
Yeah, I remember being amazed when I went to the little church in Guatemala where there was a filing cabinet and it had a file on every one of the kids, and we looked at our kid and there was a file this thick on my child, and we opened it up and you could see the records of their physical development, their spiritual development, emotional development, and intellectual development, and it was really cool to have that kind of accountability there in terms of tracking that impact. Here's another one. When someone sponsors, if a church encourages their congregation to sponsor children, does that have a negative effect on their giving to the church and offerings? We've studied that because that's a very logical concern for pastors to have. Many times, like, we're barely funding our own building projects. We're barely funding our own missions efforts. There's this mindset that it's like a pond in your backyard. The pond is only so big, and there's only so many fish in it, so you can't have too many fishing lines thrown in there because there's just not that much. That's a logical conclusion, but what we discovered, and we've been doing some research on this, what we've discovered is, everything about the kingdom of God is upside down. The first or last, the last or first, the weak or strong, the strong or weak, the little or big. And it turns out that even the economics are upside down. Yeah. And so what happens when your people get their hearts expanded to care about suffering around them, suffering all the way across the world, but suffering right in your own community, suddenly their hearts are expanded to care about everything that local body of believers is trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so instead of more lines and fewer fish caught, the pond actually expands as people begin to have the options to fully live out their faith. Yeah. And so the funding of the facility gets paid because you got engaged church members who say, this is my family and we are doing important things in the world. Yeah. And the mission efforts. And I've had so many pastors just bubble with enthusiasm that I thought this was a big risk, but it turns out the expansion of my people's hearts means funding is no longer a problem among us because we are fully alive. We are living out our faith with a passion that we didn't used to have when we were basically circling the wagons and trying to protect what little limited resources we felt we had. The bigger heart leads to bigger giving.
That's a fact.
And that's just the way it happens in the kingdom.
We have seen that time and time again.
Here's one from Shelley. It says, who provided the minute in your life?
Oh, that's a very good question. Let me tell you quickly. I told you I grew up in a little African village in the Ivory Coast, a poverty-stricken bunch of people, dear, wonderful people who took me in like their own son. But the moment that my life actually got launched was when I was about 6 years old and an epidemic of measles came through our village. Measles that should keep you out of school for a few days, but because we were already weak from the year before when a plague of locusts had come through our village and eaten everything green, we were barely hanging on. And because all the children were already weakened, measles came through and it was a killer. So I watched in the span of 2 weeks while 1 out of every 4 of my little childhood friends died of measles. And I finally, after 2 weeks, I ran to my father. He was translating scriptures in this hot tin shed, I remember. And when he looked up from this rack of Bibles he was working at, I said, Papa, I have a question. He says, what is it, son? I said, Daddy, when do you think it's my turn? And he says, your turn for what? And I said, Daddy, my turn to die. All my friends are dying. When do you think I'll die? Well, he says, you're not going to die from this, son. And I said, well, why not, Papa? How do you know? And he said, roll up your sleeve. And I rolled up my sleeve, and he said, those little scratches on your arm, those are called vaccinations. You got that in America before you came here, so you wouldn't get these diseases. And I think I became Compassion's president, even though I was only 6 years old, in that moment when, through the blur of my tears at that new shocking reality, I stammered, Papa, that's not fair. Why don't all of my friends have scratches on their arms? And I think that minute was the first time I realized that there was this kind of inequity in the world, that there were ways to solve the problems of the hurt and the loss that was going on around me. And that minute launched my heart for the poor in my fight to bring these two worlds together. Yeah. And it was a painful minute, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Good question, thank you.
Another question, does compassion engage in any form of sustainable social entrepreneurship? Any intervention programs around that?
Social entrepreneurship, are we talking cohesive
like
communities?
Micro-enterprise, I would imagine, and the question is, those kinds of things that are helping people build sustainable lives.
Yeah, we have to realize that while we absolutely hold ourselves accountable to that child's development, the child that you put on your refrigerator, we absolutely guarantee that child's development. They will be in the program for hours every week throughout the year. That is our unit of evaluation. That is our unit of output. But the child does not live in isolation. Right. They live in the context of a little family. Mm-hmm. Not everything that needs to be done for that child can be done for that child. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it has to be done for that family. Mm-hmm. For example, water is not a child's decision. It might be a family's decision. Where do we get a safe access to water? So we work to influence the family on that. Sometimes the income of the family, and most of our families live on about $1.25 a day. There's a need for training for mothers and fathers for vocational options. Right. We have some seed money to help them launch little enterprises, to get together co-ops of people who want to do this all together. So the influence goes out across the family. That spreads like wildfire across the community. And while we hold ourselves accountable to the child's development, it ripples out until the entire community is transformed. There are communities in Ecuador, for example, where it's time to move on because 85% of the people in that community have accepted Christ as their Savior. Having accepted Christ, their vision, their outlook has changed. They've welcomed innovations. They've taken on new agricultural techniques. They have started arts and craft enterprises. I take sponsors every once in a while. This is Otavalo, those of you who know Ecuador, to the market in Otavalo, and before they go out in to buy stuff, I say, no, you got to understand that every merchant in here is the mother or father of one of our kids. So don't you go getting them down to the lowest possible price here. And if you don't leave with a big hug and a word of prayer, you've done it wrong. Yeah. So it does. It ripples out ultimately. We say you change a child, you change a family changes a church changes a community, communities ultimately change regions, and ultimately nations.
Well, last question here has to do with what happens with children that graduate at 18. What is Compassion doing to help them once they graduate from the program?
Yep. There's a number of options. From the time these children are 12 years old, we sit down with them and they put together my plan for tomorrow. It's a conversation with a mentor at that local church that says, so what are you good at? What does your father do? What do you hope to do? And for the adolescent years, we move them toward the moment of graduation for them to either step out and start an entrepreneurial business that they've had in mind for a while, or to send them to a vocational option, training where they can become an electrician or they can become a beautician or whatever else their path called for. And as you know, some of them go on through university, some of them under our guidance in our leadership development program.
Right.
And so there are a number of paths at the end of graduation.
Quickly explain the leadership development program, because I'm not so sure that's very well known.
You know,
a kid graduates, and now there's a new leadership development program for certain ones of the kids that graduate
Yeah.
to enter this program.
You know, like Joshua that I talked about earlier, some of these kids, although they're born in absolute abject poverty slums settings, God wired them smart. He wired talent and ability in there. And we know these kids because we've been in their lives since they were either in the womb or 3 or 4 years old. We saw them organize the little playground games. We watched them serve food to their, we saw their leadership capacity from the time they were small. And if they can qualify for university in their country, then they go into our whole new level of program. There they go to university, they get a mentor to make sure they do. I mean, we have a 96% success rate. Freshmen graduating as seniors. They're under the tutelage of a local church. They serve in a local church. They organize themselves with conferences. We bring in speakers from their own country to talk.
Send them to our summits.
We send them by the dozens to your summits. Ultimately, what we're doing is we are raising up those who God has given this innate leadership ability. We are raising them the opportunity to rise up, understand leaders of integrity, leaders with a servant heart, leaders who have given their lives to Christ, leaders who have a warm, tender place in their heart for the rest of the world, maybe having been sponsored by an American. We are raising up a generation of leaders that are poised to transform countries. Yeah. And those of us who know poverty know that probably the biggest need is quality leadership at the heads of these nations. And we're doing it. And like I told you earlier, when you need a leader is not the time to go looking for them. You should have thought of that 25 years ago. Right. And at Compassion, you know, we have. They're amazing, amazing leaders.
Well, Wes, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. Thanks so much for sharing a bit of your story, a bit of the Compassion story. They're certainly intertwined for many years. And I just want to leave you with a final challenge to rethink your particular involvement in terms of being on the solution side to this poverty situation and getting involved personally, either yourself sponsoring a child. If you already are, might you consider another one? And perhaps even your children, getting your children involved in it and doing it together as a family. It's had a completely transforming effect on our family for sure. And then to allow the opportunity for those in your congregation to participate in sponsorship, knowing that if they do, their heart will grow, and in fact giving to the church will also grow as well. So it's a pretty cool thing. And then if your church wants to get engaged with a particular church, one of the 5,600 churches that are in Compassion's network in these 26 countries that are very impoverished, and you want to build a long-term relationship with a church or a few churches in a particular country to help care for their needs and invest in intervention programs for them, but also allow your congregation to knit their hearts with the hearts of the people in that same congregation. That's about as cool a thing as you can see in a church-to-church relationship. So again, you can go to our website. We also have some material there for you to get the link and find out more about these programs. And then also a really cool thing that Compassion is working on right now is an experience that's going to help take what's happening around the world to your doorstep through the Compassion experience. They got a couple semi-trucks that are able to come to your church, your parking lot, and set up quite quickly and allow your congregation to be transported to some place around the world where life is very, very different, and see what God might want to do through that 20-minute experience of just walking through that. So that's going to be coming out. We're going to be launching that experience at the Leadership Summit in August, and then we're going to look for a host of churches nationwide to let's fill up their schedule. Let's give our congregation the kinds of experiences that probably can only happen by getting on a plane and going there, but we know most of our people can't do that. So heads up on that. Also related to the summit, this is kind of, I'll close with this, is this next Tuesday we have our early bird deadline. Best rates to get your team signed up for the summit at this point, June 26th. So sign up your team. Right now we're in the season of working with each of our speakers to make sure that we're on the same page with what they're going to deliver at the summit. And last week Bill Hybels and I had a tremendous meeting with Jim Collins and spent about 3 hours with him walking through exactly what he was going to talk about at the summit. And I'm telling you, it's going to rock. I mean, you are going to not want to miss that talk. How to lead in the turbulent times that we find ourselves in right now. So Again, you can go to the website, sign up for that, but again, the deadline's next Tuesday for best rates. And then finally, just next month, encourage you to be with us next month's webcast, July 18. Again, 11:30 to 12:30 Central Time, same time. And we're going to discuss how to develop the leaders around you. You have a couple guests, Steve Saccone, the Director of Staff Development at the Highway Community in San Francisco, and Jeannie Stevens, the lead pastor of Soul City Church here in Chicago. And we're going to be talking about developing the leaders around you. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you next month.